Anna, can you hear me at all?
Okay, we've got our online panelists with us. So next up, we've got a panel on the EU and international landscape for children's rights and age assurance, being moderated by Anna Morgan. Anna's the head of the Irish Privacy and Data Protection Practice at Bird and Bird's Dublin office. Anna advises organisations on the broad spectrum of privacy, data protection and data security issues, and has significant expertise in matters involving the processing of children's personal data. That expertise comes from her position prior to joining Bird and Bird as Deputy Commissioner and Head of Legal Affairs in the Irish Data Protection Commission. Joining Anna on the panel, we've got Jenny Dolan, who at the DPC has been responsible for children's data protection policy. Since joining back in 2017, she's led on a number of key projects, including the development and publication of the DBC's Fundamentals for a Child-Oriented Approach to Data Processing guidance. We also have Marie Potel-Saville, who is the winner of the Impact Innovation Founder, Most Innovative Privacy Product 2022 at the International Association for Privacy Professionals. She is dedicated to fighting dark patterns and creating fair patterns, and is part of the expert support group on dark patterns at the European Data Protection Board. And then is it Claire we've got as well? Yep, Claire. We've also got Claire Quinn, Chief Privacy Officer at Privo. Claire's a subject matter expert, specialising in the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act, COPPA, the General Data Protection Regulation, and children's privacy and safety in the digital world. So I'll hand over to Anna to kick us off, if that's okay.
Thank you very much, George, and good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you all, despite the rainy weather, which I think we brought from Ireland. Great to see you all turning out to discuss age assurance in a variety of contexts. This morning, the panelists and I are going to focus on the issue of transparency under the GDPR and how that intersects with age assurance and all of the challenges that we are no doubt hearing about over the next number of days in terms of choosing an appropriate age assurance solution and implementing it. Transparency is, of course, a really key principle in terms of data protection and privacy law across Europe. It is one of the core kind of pillar requirements that data controllers must comply with when they're processing personal data. And of course, we're all familiar with the implementation of transparency requirements by way of privacy policies and privacy notices. But I think this issue around the intersection between age assurance and transparency itself is one of the least talked about aspects of protecting children online, of dealing with the challenges around implementing age verification and age assurance solutions. So really looking forward to digging into this topic today with our panel of very expert speakers who George has already kindly introduced. So I think without further ado, we might just kick off our conversation. And I think, Jenny, let's start with the regulatory perspective. As George mentioned, you're leading on children's privacy at the Irish Data Protection Commission. And so no doubt you'll have seen firsthand, I suppose, the challenges that different organisations are dealing with. And of course, there's been a rapid evolution in recent years in terms of the different age assurance technologies, particularly around, I suppose, the awareness of the need to have an effective solution. So I'm interested in what you're seeing when organisations approach the Irish Data Protection Commission for consultation purposes. What are they thinking in terms of transparency for users? Are they thinking about transparency for users in terms of telling users that there is processing happening in the background as a result of age assurance? Are they telling users about the nature of the data that's collected, about the impacts for them? Are they thinking about transparency at all?
Thanks, Anna, and thanks so much again for the invitation to join alongside a really esteemed panel of experts, so I'm delighted to be here. Yeah, so look, there has been a serious ramp up in the development of age assurance solutions, which is the reason why we're all here today. And I suppose the issue of these solutions is crossing my desk on a much more frequent basis at the DPC. And you kind of touched on this in your introduction. I mean, for me, the right to be informed is probably the most important right that a data subject has. You know, if you don't know, you can't submit an access request if you don't know who has your personal data. Likewise, you can't request that your data be deleted if you don't know it's being processed in the first place. So, but I have to say, when it comes to age assurance solutions being brought to the DPC as per our consultation function that you mentioned, it doesn't seem to me that transparency is always at the top of organisations' priority list. And the data protection impact assessments that we're seeing focus, and understandably, on the nuts and bolts of the processing, what personal data is being used, the infrastructure of the system, you know, the risks posed, the mitigating actions, that regard, all very, very important and require, you know, a serious amount of consideration. But when it comes to the DPC providing feedback, time and time again, we find ourselves asking, okay, but how are you going to inform users that this is happening? You know, what will your messaging look like? How are you going to reach users? And how are you going to explain in them in simple terms, particularly for the more complex systems that we're seeing, what it is that you're doing with their personal data, and particularly in the case of children. And another issue we're seeing is, how are you going to make sure that children are aware this messaging is for them? Because I recently had the opportunity to speak with a number of teens on a WebWise Youth Ambassador panel, more generally, I should say, on transparency in social media. And one of them said to me, we have no idea that that stuff we see upon sign up is actually for us. We just swipe right by it, not because we're disinterested, but we have no idea you actually want us to read that. So I think before we even get to the importance of simplicity around language, there's a huge stumbling block here in terms of design and signposting to younger people in particular. This information is for you. You need to read this, you know? But I suppose coming back to the specific topic of age assurance, to be honest, I think companies are really rushing to get their age assurance solutions in place, and they're often more concerned with ensuring as seamless or not even seamless, ensuring as minimum friction to the user experience as possible. And I think oftentimes transparency is coming as an afterthought. And in instances, interestingly, where it isn't an afterthought and they are thinking about it up front, we actually have heard concerns from industry that in the case of kind of age inference models, for example, that providing too much transparency information might actually enable people to circumvent systems, thus having the complete opposite intended effect. So I suppose my main message at the moment is so much hinges on getting transparency right. I think we've seen from 2 recent large-scale inquiries by the DPC, particularly into children's processing. On foot of those inquiries, 2 fines totaling €750 million were imposed on controllers, and 50% of those fines, so 325 million, related solely to infringements of the transparency principle. So I think it's evident what the cost of getting this wrong looks like. So I would stress to organisations here today that transparency should not be an afterthought. It should actually be your first thought in the context of age assurance.
Thanks so much, Jenny. I think you've done a fabulous job of setting the scene and some of the big ticket topics that we're going to delve further into as our conversation moves on today, including this really critical idea that children need to have an explanation given to them about why age assurance is being conducted and why it's kind of in their own best interest, why it's important for them. Interesting as well that you're saying, you know, some of the messaging that you're hearing from industry is around possibility of circumvention. I think we're going to circle back to that topic as well. And I suppose maybe just picking up on one of the points you made there about the race to get age assurance models in place, and I suppose the anxiety that a lot of organisations naturally have, because of course this is, as we said, this is an evolving topic. It's a topic that is still very much at the edge of innovation, and of course we're seeing lots of kind of technical solutions being kind of exhibited over the next number of days. But going back to that core principle, as you said, transparency is at the heart of every data subject's kind of entitlements under the GDPR within the EU framework, and the fact that transparency is very frequently being overlooked in terms of the design of age assurance solutions. So Clara, I might just pick up on that point and turn to you. So obviously you are dealing with industry, you're dealing with companies every single day of the week that are focused on trying to comply with the different frameworks around the world, not just in Europe, of course, and not just in the UK, but organisations that are thinking about age assurance and how to implement higher protections for children on their services. So from what Jenny has described, it does seem to be a fairly major oversight in that companies which are carrying out age assurance are not either not thinking about it at all, or they're only addressing it as an afterthought. So can you take us through some of the experiences that you have seen with companies around the transparency challenge?
Thank you. Thank you. So I would say it's really early days in the development of the mechanisms, the standards. And I think in industry, there's much confusion over, the terms, age assurance, age verification, age estimation. So it's what do we meant to be doing, and do we know what we should be doing? And there's concern about collecting more data than you really need to do the job. And so I think there's a need for much more understanding in industry of what they should be doing, let alone around transparency itself. And it will become an afterthought if we don't highlight it and push for it, particularly in the new standards that are being developed, the ISO, IEEE standard. I really hope to see end user and information for people using providers in terms of transparency. So, I think that's really clear when you look at, for example, the FTC last week denied YOTI and ESRB's application for facial age estimation. But this was done on the basis of without prejudice. So what it means is that they need more information. So even they, the regulator, need to be able to evaluate these age mechanisms and age assurance and understand them more clearly before they're prepared to, approve them as methods under COPPA in the US, for example. And I know the ICO have just recently updated their opinion on age assurance, which, that's fairly recent. So it's no wonder in the context of all of that industry and online services aren't really ready and prepared and have a good understanding of what they should be doing, let alone, providing transparent information to end users, adults and children, is often an issue. There is a huge race to regulate, particularly in the States. I mean, the work that we do in the US, we're seeing state after state coming out with age verification, social media bills with age verification being an absolute requirement. And there is a pushback from big tech and industry. We've seen injunctions around Utah and the California Age Appropriate Design Code Act. So within the context of that, you've got hundreds of online services trying to understand what they meant to be doing. And I think transparency at the moment is probably bottom of the list, and it needs to be higher, but they don't even really have their heads around the measures that they need to be implementing. So I think for years we've had broken age gate, self-declaration, turning a blind eye. There is now no choice but to comply with some of the regulatory requirements around age assurance. And I think that means that transparency cannot be an afterthought. It's got to be front and center. And I'm thinking about age providers and how they process the data and what they're doing. I think there's got to be really clear information for anyone, an online service using an age provider, an age assurance mechanism, so that they understand what's happening. We might have a member say to us, oh, there's this great facial age estimation. But our question would be, so do you understand whether that's collecting data points on the device only, or is it sending it across the internet, which obviously isn't as privacy preserving? But if they don't understand it as online services, how are the users going to know? How are they going to know what's happening to their data? And looking at it, understanding the best interests of the child, it's hard to get this right today when you look at privacy notices and terms of use. They are pages and pages long, and most adults can't navigate them. Most privacy professionals despair and throw their hands up in the air, right? So, there's a long way to go in providing information that's clear and transparent, particularly around age assurance, where it's probably more important or as important as any other processing, because there is more chance of profiles being built from inferred data, biometric data being collected. And so I really come back to, let's make sure that the standards being developed today and are in process, and while there is an opportunity, include clear guidance on end user transparency standards and what needs to happen. I know we'll touch on much more, but I think that's key, and I think industry's just trying to understand and catch up.
Thank you so much, Claire, for those insights and some really kind of fascinating points that you've made about the overall complexity of the ecosystem that we are dealing with. You mentioned, of course, that we have online service providers, we have age verification and age assurance providers as well. We have the end users. So there's quite a kind of a complicated series of structures of relationships that are at play here. And, you know, I think the point that you have made about being transparent and being focused on who we need to be transparent for, whether it's transparency within the age assurance market or transparency for age assurance, they're kind of equally important in terms of trying to deliver the end result, which is making service users online aware that their data is being processed a lot of times in the back end when age assurance and age verification mechanisms are integrated into an app or a website. I want to move on now and talk to Marie, who has joined us remotely from France. Now, Marie, you're coming at this from a slightly different angle because you are an expert in fairness, an expert in transparency, and your work over the last number of years has been very much focused on the digital user journey, and it's about helping adults and children alike to understand the impact of the data that is collected and processed about them by online services. I know you've worked with a whole variety of companies in helping to design user-friendly approaches for legal notices like privacy policies, and in fact, I should say, Marie and her team are award-winning in that respect. And you've also helped to design and support the configuration of user interfaces as well that are intended to avoid unfair patterns. So coming at it from a very much kind of transparency and fairness focused approach, Marie, I'm interested in your thoughts on the complexities of the age assurance ecosystem that Claire has touched on here. And as Claire has said, companies are clearly struggling in these early stages of adoption and selection of age assurance methods with how to do it in an appropriate and effective way. So I suppose, is it unrealistic to expect them to have to think about transparency too? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, first of all, thanks a lot, Anna, for inviting me to this great panel. Well, no, it's not unrealistic for a very simple reason. So, as you very kindly said, we specialize in age-appropriate design and privacy-enhancing design. So, for us, obviously, you know, transparency is totally front and center in any online experience, and age assurance should be no exception. Now, I fully understand that, you know, this super complex regulatory environment could be overwhelming for companies. I'm not denying that. But there are two factors that make transparency absolutely front and center, and that, you know, that mean that it should be put back on top of the list. And the first reason is actually you know, a very simple reason. Anything that users don't understand online will lead to blind signing or circumventing. In both cases, opacity and lack of understanding create more legal risks and a really bad user experience. So the legal risks created by opacity, legalese, and the walls of text that Claire was mentioning, you know, we all suffer from them, not just kids. Basically, these walls of text are plaguing the web, and the legal risks that they create are obvious. There is no informed consent, and in the case of kids in particular, they will reject anything they don't understand easily at first glance, and that immediately makes sense for them and that resonate with their environment. It means that you've got no more than a second or two to engage them and convey your key message, or they'll just ignore it and try to do what they want to do, including circumventing the age gate, simply because they don't, as Jenny reminded, they don't even know it's addressed to them. It doesn't make any sense for them, and therefore they will just, you know, do what they want to do. The legal risks are also enhanced by what behavioral science and neuroscience tell us about especially teenagers, there's clear evidence that teenagers have a greater appetite for risk. It's like their brain is sort of wired in a way around 15 years old or so that they will naturally take risks. So, this is particularly where transparency, plain language, human centricity are absolutely key to also empower them to understand things like, well, you can't unsee something you saw. These are the damages that you could suffer. You could have nightmares at night. You won't be able to erase that, harmful image from your brain. All of that is really, really important. And the other reason that really resonate with our clients, by the way, is just legal UX, or just UX, user experience per se. Most companies we work with really put the user experience at the core of everything they do. I'm thinking about video game companies, but also any other platform, online services. User experience is key. And of course, you don't want to break the user experience. Let's say they have a fantastic experience online, playing a game or just navigating an app or a site. You don't want to break that experience with all of a sudden, some content that is completely disconnected with the rest of the experience. So this applies more to privacy notices, for example, than to age gates. But the same, reasoning can apply. User experience should be paramount in every corner of the site or the app. And age gate should be no exception. Does that make sense at all?
I think that's a fantastic overview of the sorts of things that we all need to be thinking about when we are discussing effective age assurance and transparent age assurance. So thank you very much for setting the scene on that front, Marie. I do want to pick up on some of the comments that Marie has made around these transparency challenges, the fact that opacity and legalese and complexity in terms of the way information is conveyed to users is going to lead to attempted circumvention, you mentioned, Marie. And so, Jenny, I know that when you and I have kind of talked about this topic before, you have mentioned that one of the things the DPC hears quite often when companies talk to you in your consultation mode around age assurance and age verification, they say that providing too much user information about the way in which the age assurance mechanism is conducted can actually help users to essentially game the system to circumvent the mechanism itself. And I think this is a really interesting point, and I'm really curious to hear a little bit more about that. And in particular, have you been provided with evidence by online services, apps, platforms that this is actually happening in practice, that being very transparent and very clear about the nature of the age assurance mechanism that you have integrated, about why you're doing it, that is actually leading to users, I suppose, manipulating the service and trying to go around to circumvent the age gate?
Thanks, Anna. Yeah, look, for me, I think the key issue here really is the fear of this happening, right? And I don't think it's necessarily a reluctance on the part of organizations to hide the fact that they're using personal data. But there seems to be this fear that providing too much information, as you said, might enable users to push against a system to find its weak spots and to circumvent it. But I think there's often a tendency for controllers to equate providing this transparency information with almost providing a blueprint, to how their AI model works, for example. And perhaps there's more of a fear of competitors seeing that as opposed to a child or a user trying to game the system. But transparency around data processing, it doesn't mean giving away your trade secrets. It simply means giving the people whose personal data you are processing the information that they need, that it's happening, what personal data it is, why it's being used, how long you're going to keep it for, if you're using third-party providers, who and why, and how does this work, and also enabling people to exercise their rights if they so choose. And I think it's definitely possible for organisations to provide sufficient transparency information, without giving away their secret sauce. And if we take those inference models, I think most of these use multiple signals to infer age. So like if we think of it in those terms, a user would have to, a child would have to drastically alter how they interact with a service in order to trick it or to circumvent it. Now, that's not to say they won't. I mean, children are incredible and very tenacious. Interesting about what Marie mentioned about that appetite for risk. You know, maybe they will go though that far and try and beat the system. But then I think the question controllers really need to ask themselves in that instance is, if their system is so easy to game and circumvent, do they have a robust system in place to begin with? You know, so it all comes back to accountability. There are obligations under Article 24 of the GDPR to implement appropriate and technical organisational measures to mitigate against these risks. But I do think this fear factor is something that needs to be backed up with factual evidence, and it can't just be used as a reason for not providing transparency information. Because I think, Anna, you touched on this, you know, transparency is it's fundamentally linked to fairness. So if you're not open and honest with the fact that you're processing personal data, then it's very unlikely your processing will be fair, which in turn means it's very unlikely that your processing will be lawful. You know, so I think they need to take that into account. And really, my main message again is that transparency, it's not a nice to have in the context of age assurance. You know, it's an obligation. And no matter what method you're using, I think that's important to stress as well. Because when it comes to age assurance, and Claire touched on this as well, that it's still relatively novel, you know? So people aren't necessarily expecting to be confronted with this type of processing, either upfront in terms of providing ID or, you know, submitting that selfie, or even in terms of their existing information being used in the background as well. So I think actually transparency it's never been more important than in the context of age assurance. And that's particularly in light of the fact that a lot of organisations are also providing a variety of solutions when it comes to age assurance, which I think is important from an inclusion and a diversity perspective. But what you have here then are pick from this array of options with no information provided on what these different options mean from a privacy perspective for users. And what we have then are people just using the option that might be just most convenient and easiest in the moment, but without really any kind of consideration given to what selecting one method over another means for their personal data.
Thanks, Jenny. Some really interesting points that you've made, and I think we're going to pick up on a few of those a little bit later on. But I suppose one of the things that you said that really struck me is the fact that the GDPR obligation around transparency, it certainly does not require companies to disclose their confidential information, their trade secrets, possibly information that would be, you know, helpful to competitors around the way in which they are integrating solutions and actually using data to conduct age assurance. I think another really interesting point that you've kind of emphasised throughout the comments you've made this morning is about I suppose the essential nature of transparency as one of the fundamental principles of the GDPR. You mentioned the DPC fines that have been levied in the context of children's processing of children's data, and how transparency was the major component, I suppose, in terms of the fine in the two major cases in Instagram and TikTok. And I suppose that you also reminded me of one of the kind of critical comments that has been made by the European Data Protection Board in its transparency guidelines, which go way back to 2017, 2018, which is that users should not be surprised about the way in which their personal data is processed. Of course, that's not something that the GDPR itself specifically calls out, but it's very much a theme that regulators at the EDPB as a whole has adopted, that you need to understand the multiple ways in which your data might be processed. And I think we might revisit that point a little bit later on. But Claire, I want to maybe stay with this overall theme, I suppose, of balancing competing objectives. And of course, every online service provider, you know, they are there for commercial reasons. You know, they want to be able to, I suppose, make the most of their service, to have this kind of frictionless approach to the user journey, which Marie mentioned. But of course, then they're trying to balance all of these additional challenges, and one of these is the transparency challenge when they're trying to implement age assurance. So I'm interested in what Privo's approach is when you go about assessing compliance with the GDPR, for example, for your certification programs. Do you look at transparency as an aspect of GDPR compliance for processing of children's data?
Thank you, Anna. So yes, we absolutely do. It's a key part of the work that we do in a programme. I think what's important is we do start with going back to what Jenny was talking about, the fundamentals of understanding what data is being collected, how it's processed, retention, security of that data, and also looking at, is there any secondary use of it? How has it been collected and used? Because unless you understand all of those things in your online service, you're not going to understand how to communicate what you're doing to the user effectively at the end of that process. And I think that the whole fairness and transparency is really even more key when you're dealing with children who have less understanding of what they're starting in a user flow when they're signing up, when they're giving away their data. And I think it's very important that we also assess the fact that when we're looking at how they're messaging children and how they're communicating, is it clear to the user that this data is going to a third party, and what does that really mean for them? So, I think those are key parts of our programme. And I think looking at the messaging itself, and we'll come on to that in a little bit more detail, is really important. A lot of our members say, I don't want to put too much information in our privacy policy about security. And we always say, well, you have to tell them the basics of what you're doing so they know their data is secure as an end user. But you don't give away your encryption method or similar. And I think it's similar with the whole age assurance process. The user needs to know that it's happening and why, because it's of a benefit to them. And they're much less likely to try and circumvent if they think that they're going to have something from this experience and they're going to gain something from it. So, it's in their best interest to use it because it's going to give them a more appropriate experience. So, we look at where the notices are in the user flow, how the process happens for the user. What do they see as they go? Is it a just-in-time notice and so on, so that they're aware? I mean, in our Privo age-aware solutions, we have a Y flow, and that Y flow will tell the user as they step through the process exactly what's happening and why. It doesn't tell them how, and I think that's really important, the why and the how. If you remember that when you're trying to message and you're trying to show end users some transparent notices, it's tell them why, tell them what's collected, but not how you do it. You don't give away your secret sauce in doing it. And it's the same principle as when you're communicating your security measures and standards. So I think those are the most important key things. And again, coming back to, in the messaging, is it clear to the end user what data is actually being collected and how it's used? Because if it's being used to create a profile of that user and that's going to be used for something else, obviously we're going to assess whether that's okay or not, but it's important for the end user to know what happens and what's going to happen to their data. So all of those things, but we really start with the building blocks of the what's collected, how is it used and how it's retained. And then we can look at how that informs their transparency and their messaging to their end users. And then, really important with children, to look at how that messaging is communicated. Why am I being asked this? What's the benefit of being asked this? Because you're going to engage them much more if you give them that transparent information. And, we know from the work that Five Rights have done and others in industry that children actually want to protect themselves. They want to know that they are going to not be subject to risks and harms. And that they're always going to transgress, we know that too, but it's really important that they have an understanding of what they're doing, why they're doing it, and the benefit that brings them, because then they will engage and have a safer experience. And the last thing I would say is, we really look for privacy-preserving methods when our members are choosing age assurance providers. If you can find a method that allows, not to collect data at every front door, to have some kind of federated identity, a privacy signal. We've been developing a privacy signal, which is incredibly privacy preserving in the sense that it's a device signal. It puts the online service on notice they're dealing with a child. Then you don't have to collect more data at every door, which is one of the biggest issues. You have hundreds of online service providers with different age assurance mechanisms, all collecting data. And I think, minimizing the amount of data that's collected to preserve the privacy of the child while knowing how old they are helps your transparency in all of your services. So, I think it's really about doing the full process of understanding what's collected, how it's used, and then making sure that they're communicating it effectively without giving away the secret sauce.
Thanks, Claire. And of course, easier said than done, as many people in the room will know, because where you're dealing with a multi-layered, multiple experience, say online provider, such as a gaming experience like Marie mentioned earlier, there are many complexities, I suppose, in terms of the design and the integration, the timeliness of the delivery of these sorts of important messages that the service provider is delivering to its users, particularly where they are children. So I just want to pick up on that theme about the user experience flow and the importance of conveying a very kind of transparent message about why age assurance is actually important, why it's good for the user, particularly where the user is a child, Marie. In your experience around legal design and working with companies who are deploying one or more age assurance solutions within their service, what are the sorts of things that you guide your clients to consider when they are looking at the integration and the deployment of those different age assurance solutions?
Great question. Thanks a lot. Basically, the key is to really listen and understand what kids and teens are telling you. And so one of the most important advice is to co-create, to have co-creation workshops and focus groups with kids and teens. So we've been facilitating dozens of focus groups with children as young as 8 years old. So of course you need to do it, appropriately. So usually we divide age groups from 8 to 10, then to 11 to 14, and then 15 to 17. And then we might also have a group for parents. But basically what we learned from all of these workshops that we facilitated around the EU and the US with kids is that no matter how young they are, kids as young as 8 years old, they do care about their privacy. First of all, they do understand what privacy means. They do understand what their security means, and they express it in very cute terms of their own, but they really grasp the concept. Now, there are things that they might, struggle to understand, such that, okay, there's a company behind the game they're playing, or there's, a company behind the app or the social network. But there are ways to communicate that message effectively. It could be storytelling. It could be very plain language in minimal doses of information. I guess that's also a very important point that we advise our clients on. Of course, naturally, that the doses of information that kids can absorb is minimal, but actually it's even shorter than what you could imagine. So you need to be very, very disciplined. Basically one line or 1 line and a half, that's usually enough. The other very important points to bear in mind are that any graphic assets that you choose should really resonate with the kind of environment kids and teens are used to. Any graphic design that would be, childish. For example, we made an experiment in one of our focus groups on a model interface for the French DPA, which had a cute little squirrel. I liked it. And the kids hated it. They said that it was completely childish. They completely rejected it. So you need to be really careful about any graphic assets. Anything childish will be rejected, and you need to find the right graphic universe that basically mirrors the experience that they will have on the rest of the site, if that's applicable. Also, I guess we also guide our clients towards, transparency. Again, we might have pushback, but again, it's really, really important. And so what we're seeing, by the way, is that more and more clients come to us with basically, they've understood that transparency is important. They just don't know how, but it's a first step towards really making it efficient.
Thanks, Marie. I think some really interesting points that you've made there about children are curious, they're interested, they're engaged in their own rights, and they want to protect their own privacy. But at the same time, as you've said, they don't like being patronized by, say, the wrong type of graphic. I think that's that's quite enlightening. And of course, you've mentioned as well this kind of seamless user experience, Marie, and the importance of ensuring that, again, going back to the point that we were talking about earlier, the frictionless, seamless experience, so that the benefit of the age assurance isn't actually interfering with the enjoyment of the service that the child is engaging with. Claire, of course, you've talked us through the approach that Privo takes to its child protection programs, and of course you're focused, as we have heard from you, on the issues of children's rights, participation and empowerment, which of course come from the international framework on children's rights within the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. And we've been talking so far about transparency approaches, and we've touched on this argument around circumventability as well, and you mentioned the messaging for children, and of course that's what Marie has been talking about too. But in your experience in working with industry, is that actually happening? Are companies actually taking the sorts of steps that Marie has described towards trying to convey in an appropriate and a kind of I suppose an age appropriate way towards children without patronizing them with graphics that they might consider appropriate for kids who are much younger than them? Are they being kind of guided to, I suppose, want to understand what is happening in terms of the age assurance environment and the processing of their data that must most of the time accompany that?
Very good question, Anna, because I guess if I was to give a broad, simple answer, no. But in general, there's definitely a change and a move towards giving children notices and messaging that works for them. I think age assurance needs to be communicated to children as not a blocker, but an enabler. And I think that's really important for online services to remember in their messaging. My experience as well has been, as a chief of safety at an MMO, parents were constantly asking, why can't my child access the older experience? I want them to have everything. So, you can use your transparency and your messaging as an education as well. And there are some in industry that are starting to do it, and we're seeing it come through, and it's really heartening when you start to see some of the companies, particularly ones we work with, thinking about it, building it into their processes. I think we've seen for younger children, Lego do an amazing job with their notices for children. We've worked with others that have built privacy policies around the characters that are in their online service, animations and messaging that engages the child, so they feel almost like they're in the user experience, experiencing the content while they're being delivered the vital information they need. So I think that's really important. We know that Ofcom and the ICO had a report out in 2022 on families' attitudes to age assurance. And when you look at that, and we've seen that, through our work in industry, it's been very much a question of, well, I get why you want to stop me looking at adult products and services. I know why they don't want me to look at porn, but why do I have to do this to just play a game? And parents have thought it too. So building the transparency principles into the user flows and into the messaging, really echoing what Marie has said. We've seen some of our members start to pick up and build on it. We have one casual simulation who's built an AI bot. And really from the very beginning of engaging with the child, right through to the point where they're already in the service and doing, they've got privacy settings and default settings that they can turn on and off. From age assurance through to all of those actual in-use experience features, they provide just-in-time notices. And it's all in the format, look and feel of the experience. So the child is getting the messaging at the moment, at the right time, and it's much more powerful than a link to a privacy policy or a notice that is hard to read, and children just aren't going to read it anyway. So, I think that's really important. We do know from the work that's done in industry that kids want to understand, they want to avoid the harms and risks, but they want a good experience. They want one of the best experiences. And it is about communicating that message. And I just keep coming back to it, I know, but it's why I'm telling you I'm collecting this data from you. But the reason I'm doing it is because, and you are going to have the best experience by doing this. And that prevents an element of the circumventing. We know for years that self-declaration and broken age gates have been in place, and industry, including us, are developing smarter age gates but we consider those a first line of defense in terms of they're not robust enough to protect children from the risks and harms that they might experience. So, I think it's really important to get that messaging in context, in the look and feel of the site or service, and take them on a journey. And then they'll understand why they shouldn't try and circumvent it, why it's better for them. Kids are amazing, as you said, Jenny. They're tenacious and smart, and they're always going to be able to game things. But putting, I think Beeban mentioned it earlier in her keynote, putting up the fact that there is a risk here. They go into it with their eyes wider open than they did before. So yet we are beginning to see a change, and I find that very heartening, and it's very creative and imaginative when it's coming, which is important when you're dealing with kids.
Thanks, Claire. Really important points that you've raised there around the child user's journey, their experience through a site, through an app, through a service, and of course Marie as well has talked about the importance of the look, the feel, the need to mirror the experience online in terms of the delivery of that additional information around transparency and age assurance. The messaging itself, I'm actually curious to kind of dig a little bit more into your experiences, Marie, and I know you look at these sorts of things from a neuroscience perspective as well as from the kind of the legal design perspective. How do you think kids actually view age assurance? Do they actually equate age assurance with helping to protect them from the things that they don't want to see, from having the experiences that they don't want to be a part of? Because we've all read the statistics, we've read the reports around the proportion of children who are confronted with things online within a few minutes of kind of accessing a service that they just do not want it to be part of their online experience. So is there a disconnect in terms of children understanding that age assurance is actually about preventing their exposure to those sorts of things that make them feel uncomfortable and upset?
So the first thing is to never make assumptions about what kids or teens are thinking about anything, age assurance or anything else. And so in any project, it's really, really important to verify what they really think in that particular case, in this, on this particular app or social network, because it really changes from one project to another. So don't make assumptions, but really ask the kids and teens themselves and have a focus group to learn what they really think. Now, in most of our focus groups, again, in the EU, the US and the UK, usually the first reflex of the kids when they're faced with an age gate is it's not fair. It's not fair. You don't know me. You don't know whether, I'm more mature for my, most of them think they're more mature for their age than they perhaps are. But, they have this feeling like it's unfair. You don't know me. You shouldn't have the right to decide for me what I should see or not. Now, of course, there's a second reflex, which is because it's prohibited, they might, be more encouraged even to transgress, which is completely a normal human reaction, especially at that age. Now, what's also very important to understand is that if you explain the true purpose, and exactly as Claire said, it's not a blocker, but it's an enabler for you to grow in a healthy way, in a more serene way. It will make you, grow safely. then they understand. But it's a fine balance, between you can't see that and here's why. And sometimes, it can be interesting to also experiment what works best to circumvent or to bypass this first reflex. And just so you know, we've done some experiments with kids where they go through a very short series of questions. Like, have you already had nightmares after seeing this or that? And we give very concrete examples without shocking them. They're not seeing the examples, but we're just explaining. Or have you already had the feeling that you can't get a particular image or a particular word out of your head? Things like that. So they first go through these questions and then they're presented with the age gate, and results are pretty positive. But again, don't make assumptions, and in each case, do make focus groups and test. That's we haven't talked about it yet, but user testing is absolutely key if you want to be sure that your age assurance mechanism is fully understood and therefore efficient.
Thanks, Marie. So what I'm hearing very loud and clear from you is that blunt tools and kind of common standardized approaches will not work with children. There's really important, I suppose, an important message there in terms of tailoring the child's experience in terms of the service that they themselves are using, because the calibration point, I suppose, that fine balance around explaining to them in a way that they're going to engage with is going to be critical to age assurance. I think we might just take questions at the very end. I have one last question. I know we are running short on time. I do want to just turn to Jenny, because I think very many people in the room will be interested on this last point, which is about the work that the European Data Protection Board has been doing, Jenny, over the last number of years in terms of its guidance around processing children's data. Myself and many other people are keenly awaiting the publication of that guidance. Is there anything that you can share with us today in terms of an update on those guidelines? And in particular, will those guidelines address these topics we've been discussing today around age assurance and transparency in the context of age assurance?
Thanks, Anna. Yeah, so I mean, as you've mentioned, the guidelines are still under development, so I'm kind of limited in terms of what I can say in relation to substance, but they're progressing well. There will be a section dedicated to transparency and what good practice looks like that in general and examples thereof. There will also be a section on age assurance, and I suppose, as we've mentioned earlier, given that any age assurance method deployed must comply with the principles of data protection under Article 5, it kind of goes hand in hand that transparency in relation to age assurance will be dealt with in the guidance as well. But I think it's worth highlighting at this point that the excuse me, the EDPB is also working on a separate statement on age verification criteria concurrently, and it's likely this statement will precede the children's guidelines. So again, given it's under development and we're early days, so I can't really go into the substance, but I suppose in terms of the rationale as to why the statement is being produced, the EDPB are very conscious of a newly formed European Commission task force on age verification under the Digital Services Act. And the EDPB, excuse me, are a member of this board, of this task force. So we were very cognizant of the importance of having a unified EDPB approach on age verification as quickly as possible. There's also a lot of work being done by several DPAs concurrently on issues around age assurance, which is very positive and great to see, but it does highlight that risk of taking different approaches amongst different DPAs in the EU. So again, this is an effort to tackle that as well. So work has commenced on this specific statement, and it will look at the principles and rules deriving from the GDPR in relation to processing for the purposes of age verification. And the intent is to provide high-level principles and criteria when it comes to designing age verification systems. So the DPC is a co-rapporteur on that statement, along with our Spanish colleagues who I see here, our French colleagues, and some of our German colleagues from North Rhine-Westphalia. So there's lots of work being done, rest assured.
Thank you, Jenny. I think lots of us will be eagerly watching out for both the statement and the guidelines. So I think we had one question. We probably just have time for one question, I think, at this point.
Okay, thank you. Jutta Kroll from the German Digital Opportunities Foundation. It just came to my mind when you were talking that we should communicate age verification or age assurance as not a blocker, but as an enabler. And Marie referred to children feeling discriminated when they have to age verify. Wouldn't it be a natural conclusion to say that everybody needs to age verify, regardless of being a child or a minor or an adult? Wouldn't that be a natural conclusion?
Thank you, Jenny. I might ask you, just in terms of, I suppose, the comments that you've just made, which are to the effect that age verification is something that we are seeing as a requirement across lots of different pieces of legislation, including the DSI. But there's also, of course, the Audiovisual Media Services Directive. There's the European Commission on the proposal to combat child sexual abuse material. There's the EIDAS second regulation. So there are lots and lots of, I suppose, converging requirements around age verification. And I presume that is part of the work that is being done in terms of the statement that you've mentioned. That's one of the factors behind that kind of joint statement.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think when we think of age assurance, we automatically think of children and preventing access and blocking as opposed to enabling. But of course, it will inevitably lead to the processing of personal data of adults as well in order to get to that point where we're distinguishing between children and adults. So the statement that will be published will, of course, take into account that. Don't know if you had anything you wanted to add.
Yeah, just quickly. It's really important to know your audience and know your audience ages, because there are times when an online service doesn't want an adult in a chat room or a private environment with a child. So understanding the age of the audience is absolutely key, and that's going to involve verification or age assurance methods for all users, not just children. I think they go hand in hand.
Thank you very much, Claire. So I think that is us at about time right now. So I'd like to thank sincerely the wonderful panel of experts that we've had the privilege of listening to this morning, to Claire, to Jenny and to Marie. And thank you all very much for joining us here for this discussion.